Good afternoon. My name is Russ Derry. I'm the Pediatric Epilepsy Program Coordinator at Mott Children's Hospital. And this is our Epilepsy Expert webinar. The topic for today's webinar is assessing and addressing cognitive function in pediatric epilepsy. We're so glad you can join us today. And we are very happy to have with us as our guest speaker, Dr. Brandon Almy, who is a pediatric neuropsychologist at Mott Children's Hospital in Michigan Medicine. And Dr. Almy, I will let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the introduction. So I've got a perhaps slightly ambitious outline planned for us today, but first off, I'm going to start talking about the cognitive functions that are affected by pediatric epilepsy. And then I'll talk about kind of our role as pediatric neuropsychologists. How do we assess and address these functions and kind of what happens during an evaluation? It can be kind of a mysterious process. I want to talk a little bit more about that. Then there'll be a pause, and I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the helpful intervention strategies and technologies that kind of I've kind of gained experience with over the course of my training and here at Michigan Medicine, and then kind of a final discussion and question and answer forum towards the end. So to get just as a really brief introduction, there's three major groups of seizures we think about when we're talking about pediatric epilepsy: kind of focal onset starting in one area of the brain, generalized onset that affects both sides, and kind of unknown onset. And certainly there's kind of a vast array of kind of seizure presentations. There can be differences in awareness, whether or not the child knows a seizure is happening, as well as kind of motor versus non-motor presentations. So is there bodily movement or no bodily movement kind of associated with these seizures? And epilepsy is just a disorder of the brain that results in these types of seizures. And there are a wide range of different epilepsy syndromes. I won't kind of go over all of these kind of in details, but these three are kind of some of the more common ones I've had experience working with here at Michigan Medicine. And they generally have kind of an onset either in adolescence or in childhood. Now, granted, children can have seizures that don't map on neatly into an epilepsy syndrome. So generally speaking, when a pediatric neuropsychologist gets a referral question from neurology saying there's seizures involved, we're talking a little bit about how they present, when they started, kind of things like that. Now, it's a complex task, and there's no need to memorize this figure to really understand it in depth. But for me, this is kind of saying, hey, pediatric epilepsy requires a team of a lot of different people, because these seizures can have different kind of reasons for why they occur, where they occur, how often they occur, et cetera, et cetera. And it's important to just have a good kind of understanding of all of those pieces. For our role as a pediatric neuropsychologist, I'm certainly mindful of the larger elements of this background, and we'll talk a little about this kind of more in detail later, but I'm primarily focused on cognitive function or development. Neurology, they do a great job reading the EEGs, MRIs, and certainly I read those too, but I'm really focused in on kind of the cognitive functioning and neurodevelopment, which is kind of like saying, how is the child problem solving or thinking in their environment? How are different skills developing? What should we be mindful of as the child gets older or goes throughout kind of different grades in school? So the big point of this talk will be about this kind of orange circle, the cognitive function or development within kind of the larger context of seizures. So a lot of the there are a lot of kind of cognitive functions is involved, given you can kind of see how in-depth that diagram was. And certainly for pediatric neuropsychology, we're especially mindful of intellectual functioning. Now, there are kind of some misconceptions that intelligence testing is just one thing, but for a lot of the tests we use, there's kind of different components of it. In this case, we can kind of think about skills like a librarian. So that might be kind of verbal reasoning, understanding of words and what they mean. Architect, visual spatial type tasks. Detective, can you kind of see different patterns and kind of get an idea of what should come next? And then also kind of more efficiency measures. So general manager, can you hold a couple of things in mind while producing the correct answer? And just, can you be efficient and attentive on a more maybe simple task, but making sure that you're accurate and efficient in completing those tasks. So all of those pieces kind of fall under that umbrella of intellectual functioning, and they kind of help inform what cognitive functions are being affected by epilepsy or the seizure disorder. Now, we also do a little bit with language, mostly around a measure of receptive, sort of what the child knows or can kind of hear a word and know what picture best depicts that word. Expressive, kind of the reverse. Can they see a picture and say, hey, this one word best depicts that picture? And also kind of some direction following. And I have that with help from speech pathology too, because if you've done a pre-surgery workup or have had a child get worked up for pre-surgery, there's also kind of a speech language pathology eval too as well. So we're kind of getting two experts weigh in on that domain of language. And then perhaps most important is memory. So we look at memory both kind of in verbal and visual formats. So whether for verbal, it's things like stories or lists or sentences. And for visual, we do things like spatial arrangements, designs, things like that. But we're making sure that we're getting both a measure of verbal and visual memory, just to kind of get a good understanding of that child's thinking and problem solving specific to kind of those memory domains. So these would be kind of three cognitive function areas that are affected by epilepsy. And some kind of big ones too would be the attention, executive functioning. I'll talk a little bit more about why the airplane makes some sense later on, but also just kind of sustained attention, so kind of staying on track. This is definitely a concern that parents have when it comes to epilepsy in school and sort of the child's development. And we get a number of measures that are looking at this kind of very broad domain. And I'll be focusing a lot of the interventions and strategies within this domain too as well. Then there's also academic skills. So we're looking at things like math and reading, especially for children who are in elementary school. We're wanting to look at how those reading skills are progressing, so we get a good estimate of those. And then finally, certainly cognition is a major point of the pediatric neuropsychology evaluation, but we also want to make sure that we're checking in on the emotional and behavioral functioning too. It's not uncommon for pediatric epilepsy or children with epilepsy to have anxiety, depression, or other mood or behavioral concerns. And so we want to do our due diligence and make sure we get a good estimate of that functioning as well. So given all of these domains, the main role that we'd be looking at is we're having a child come in and we're going to capture kind of baseline levels. So maybe where a child might start or where they are at currently during the course of epilepsy, right? We know epilepsies are chronic conditions, so we're getting kind of a snapshot in time that may allow for longitudinal assessment or kind of looking at a trajectory with multiple evaluations. The pattern of strengths and weaknesses can give clues to lateralization, so kind of what side of the brain a seizure may be starting on. Is that something that pediatric neuropsychology will also kind of weigh in on during the course of the evaluation? We can also look at response to treatment. So let's say a new medication's been started, or there's post-surgical testing. We might do a follow-up evaluation, kind of assess change, or again, kind of get that trajectory that I was talking about. And again, thinking about those kind of comorbid mental health and behavioral concerns. Now, we're kind of considering all of this above within the larger kind of social and developmental considerations of the child, right? We know it's not just a brain in a vacuum, but a brain that's developing and growing within a family context, a peer context, a school context, a societal context. We're not going to put a two-page dissertation about the bigger forces into a report, but we are kind of mindful about, what are the larger influences that might be at play here. Perhaps the most kind of relevant one, especially for me, kind of over my training the last 5 or more years, has been the role of the pandemic, right? So school disruption, when that happened, the timing of that for learning, how it affected children versus adolescents, families' own response to that. That all is an important part of the context when kind of thinking about these cognitive skills that we're assessing. We're really not trying to assess the skills in the vacuum. We're thinking about kind of the larger implications of what these skills might mean. Now, the evaluation specifically addresses thinking and problem solving through performances. So we're bringing a child into our office and we're observing what they can complete on structured tasks. I mentioned this to be very deliberate in the sense that this is not really, in some ways, like a school day where a child might be doing different tasks or solving problems, but in other ways it's not. In a sense, there's one-on-one attention. To kind of standardize tests, it should be very clear what the child needs to do at pretty much every minute of the evaluation, where the psychometrist or the examiners is really keeping that person on task, and it's structured. That way we have a better comparison and it can look at development. Without kind of those standardization methods, it's a bit trickier. So it's kind of this very standardized, structured environment. So that usually happens over the course of like an entire kind of testing day in some cases. But importantly, we all know that that is not, that 4-hour or multiple hour session is not necessarily how the child is like outside of evaluation. And so we also look at questionnaires that address these types of thinking and problem solving in other domains, be it school, at home, or kind of other contexts. And so really these questionnaires are really important, just kind of, as a mild anecdote, you might have a child, you see this often maybe with ADHD, which can be comorbid with epilepsy, where in a one-on-one setting with that kind of adult attention and really good structure, you're not seeing the distractibility, the impulsivity, the inattention. But for the interview, that's kind of what I'm hearing about at school or other contexts. And so just because we don't see those symptoms in our testing situation, we're very mindful that the testing environment is one environment of many, and that we're getting information from you on these questionnaires and our interview about how things are kind of going overall. And so the performance is most often compared to children who are a similar age as the patient, so probably within the range of, say, 4 months or so, sometimes a longer age, but we're always getting kind of age-based norms for the most part. Sometimes grade level can be used, but really kind of comparing kids to other kind of kids that person's age. And ultimately, we chart across the domains I kind of listed earlier, those 6 domains, and then a couple more. We chart where their performance falls on a wide spectrum of kind of an area of weakness to an area of strength. And certainly, a big part of the evaluation is that we're not looking to see someone it's not like school where you want to ace everything or get 100% or get things correct. That's not, or by design, the evaluation isn't supposed to be that way. It's kind of supposed to feel like a lot of work and a lot of effort. And also, too, if we were all to take a neuropsychological evaluation, we'd all have our own patterns of strengths and weaknesses, too. And it's really that pattern that kind of helps us think about treatment recommendations and kind of, thinking about development as a whole. It's less about a specific score or even just kind of, what the score is sometimes. It's more about kind of that pattern of strengths and weaknesses. And with pediatric neuropsychology, so this is kind of like the neuropsychology version of that seizure chart I showed earlier, where we know that on a given day, a large number of factors can affect what falls into that test profile. So I really kind of I could have spent the entire hour talking about different epilepsy syndromes, but really each of those syndromes might be associated with a different neuropsychological test profile. And that's just part of the syndrome element too. There's also things like day of things, such as quality of sleep, mood, motivation. These can always affect kind of neuropsychological performance. I think especially with a pediatric sample, there's times where just instructions are forgotten. You have to say, hey, I know I saw the kiddo forget the test instructions. I know this isn't at their best because I have 2 other hours of information where they did remember the test instructions. So a lot of these things kind of go into a performance. And there really is kind of an emphasis on performances, right? These are performances in time. They're not necessarily kind of stable indicators. They're not kind of a crystal ball that says you will always be like this throughout school. They're really like a performance on a given day. And especially with children, especially younger children, those performances are kind of subject to change kind of over the course of an evaluation or just over the course of their development. So just things to kind of generally keep in mind when thinking about that kind of neuropsychological test profile and things that we're usually kind of assessing as the evaluation unfolds. Now, for the nitty-gritty, generally speaking, for some of our epilepsy evaluations, it's usually either a half to a full day. A child will usually start testing with psychometrist. That psychometrist is the person who is keeping the child on track, reading the test directions, getting the data from the test. A lot of the time is spent with the psychometrist. The neuropsychologist will interview the parent or family, kind of what that child is testing. And then the neuropsychologist will also interview the child and complete additional testing there. So it's kind of these 3 steps. It takes a while because, as you can imagine, with those domains we looked at, there are a number of different tests we want to get at. Sometimes they can vary by age too, in terms of length or duration. So even though it's only kind of 3 steps, this can easily take up a good chunk of the day for outpatient testing. And now for after the evaluation, we'll look over the testing results, we'll add in the background information, and we'll re-review the medical record. So we review the medical record before testing to get a sense of what to expect, school records, and we'll give summary impressions and other recommendations. often there's a feedback session with caregivers or the caregivers and adolescent to kind of go over the findings and recommendations. I have these kind of two tests listed here because the one with the big X on it is a sustained attention task. That's one of the longer tasks we give. And I would say 99% of children and adolescents always remember this as like the most boring or kind of the most annoying test. It really kind of stands out. So I like to kind of talk about, well, why do we make you sit through that? What does that tell us about your performance? What might that tell us about school? And so I always want to kind of give that opportunity to talk about the results. And with adolescents, and maybe 12 or older, roughly speaking, they answer a lot of questions about identity or their personality or how they might feel emotions. I also think it's important to have space there to talk about what they did. They gave us 4 to 6 hours of good effort. I want to make sure that they kind of get some of those responses back. And then ultimately, too, testing can be a component of IEP meetings or school discussions, as our testing can secure accommodations at school, such as extended time on tests or kind of classroom supports. So I would say that is probably like a whirlwind review of kind of the neuropsychological testing process. I kind of hit on some of the highlights, but any questions at this point or kind of a review of kind of the neuropsychological process at all? I'm happy to pause and answer questions here as they come up in the chat, or feel free to ask aloud.
And feel free to unmute yourself if you do have a question right now. Otherwise, we will have time at the end of the session.
All right, I will unpause and I'll play, and I'll talk a little bit about intervention strategies and et cetera, kind of related to all of what I talked about a little bit earlier. And ultimately, we might think that, we mapped out those 6 domains of functioning. You might think that, well, if we know that, say, visual memory is an area of weakness, let's just kind of train visual memory until we can't anymore. And I think some research has looked at training specific facets of kind of the specific cognitive functions that are affected by epilepsy. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of what that might look like. But I think in my read of the research, I think the most sensitive time resource or financial resource strategies tend to be broad, and they tend to be a bit more focused on learning in general. And so I'm going to start with some of these kind of broad-based views on what I think would be helpful for thinking about all of the ways in which that epilepsy can result in, say, some memory concerns, right? Limited attention, difficulties in school, right? Given a range of those matters, what might be some interventions or strategies as a parent you might be kind of mindful of? And to kind of start broad-based, if I'm thinking across both school or thinking across both cognitive and emotional environments, I'll go with sleep. And now, unfortunately, sleep is kind of another system that it wasn't necessarily included on that earlier figure I showed, but can be affected by epilepsy, be it certain epilepsy syndromes or certain epilepsy, certain seizures happen at night, and they can certainly affect sleep. Seizures also happen at night and can affect sleep there. And this graph kind of shows that the anticonvulsants and sleep disorders can affect sleep, result in sleep fragmentation, which can result in increased seizures, a lower seizure threshold, and kind of so on and so forth. So certainly on a biological level, the sleep is an important thing to keep in mind. But you also kind of see the broad-based effects of sleep on, say, daytime sleepiness, the learning and behavior, which is pretty broad too, but also just the quality of life for children kind of and their caregivers. And then I'll also kind of comment too and say that as someone who was researching adolescent development in graduate school, sleep was kind of the trendy topic in terms of thinking about, well, it's really important for mental health, for mood, but also for learning. So if I think about kind of a broad-based behavior that might be helpful in terms of helping with learning, helping with cognition, helping with mood, getting sleep is super, super, super important. And certainly there are kind of different websites. This one's on Very Well Family about kind of do's and don'ts around a bedroom routine. And certainly I know there can be, and we'll talk a little bit about tech in a little bit, there can be high-tech options probably around sleep and routines, But some of the more kind of basic behavioral stuff that we've been talking about for a while now helps with kind of a routine to get started. So I think keeping it short, making it age appropriate, getting the room dark, and kind of being consistent with this routine in terms of it's something you do most days. The more consistency, the better. You're essentially building an association between your body and the bedroom to say, hey, we're going to sound this time, and I'm in this setting. It's when my body needs to sleep. And so certainly there's some good do's or don'ts across the internet, but I thought these were some good ones kind of from Very Well Family on the importance of sleep. So sleep being one behavior I think of when I think about both mood regulation, but also kind of learning, memory, and cognitive development. But then also, I think it's also worth mentioning too, something that's called like a growth mindset. And I'm sure that is something that's becoming more often used in school to kind of talk about different approaches to learning. And I think sometimes there is kind of a narrow interpretation to think about growth mindset only specific to, say, intelligence. But I show this slide because it's not uncommon for me to hear about kids who are learning or kids who are in school where a lot of their initial kind of comments are more of the fixed mindset approach. And I don't necessarily think that's because we're maybe born with a fixed mindset or that's the default, but it's just like, right, we like things that are easy and fun, and school generally is not easy or fun for most people. And it can be really stressful, or it can feel frustrating to be challenged. And so I really want to reframe challenging or failure or kind of like these weaknesses as kind of opportunities to grow. And I think if I think about across all the intervention kind of strategies, or I think about any sort of behavioral change, without kind of an idea that you can change or you can get better, that's going to make for a harder time to address kind of the cognitive functions we were talking about. If you have, say, low working memory, or think that, oh, it's always going to be not a lot of, I don't have great memory skills, I'll never remember anything, I can't change, you're not going to be as susceptible or amenable to interventions that are meant to increase that memory and or increase your functioning without this kind of mindset here. So feedback's a good example. Challenges help me to grow. I do think that this is an important ingredient. Now, I wouldn't say it's the only one. Like, right, I really want to be cognizant and say, so we're not just recommend just doing growth mindset and expecting a whole bunch of change, but certainly it is important to kind of have that mindset when thinking about cognitive change and kind of getting better or kind of improvement. And so with those two kind of broad caveats in mind, before I went into kind of some of the specific elements, I did want to give some good websites or resources I find that talk a little bit about these two things, but also kind of are more narrowly tailored to families who have a child with epilepsy, systems and kind of things they might be getting used to or might be experiencing throughout school. So understood.org is a really great one. They have a lot of good school supports. They talk about things that might be comorbid with epilepsy, such as ADHD, learning disabilities, and other kind of learning differences. So it's a really great resource for parents and families. They've got great tips, information, techniques, skills that really help. I would say they cover a lot of the domains you talked about, be it attention, executive function, academic skills. I do also give some emotional behavioral functioning support too as well. This would be a really great website for parents and families, and also adolescents to kind of learn more about how they can approach school more effectively. Because ultimately, I feel like with across a lot of those kind of cognitive functions we talked about and the role of epilepsy on those functions, it's school that tends to be kind of the biggest hurdle or obstacle, or where both child and parent are just experiencing friction. And so for me, I'm thinking of the broader picture. The more tools you can give around school and learning and time management, the better. And certainly understood.org is a good website for that piece there. Now, related to school, and I think when I think about one of the big kind of value addeds of our evaluations is that it helps to start a process with schools about, say, accommodations and modifications, individualized education programs or IEPs, 504 plans, right? There's certainly, I really view the evaluations from a sense of equity. I think of school as a place where all children should have, reasonable access and fair access to these services. And when you have epilepsy that's kind of bringing you to school with, say, decreased sleep because of medication or seizures, some of those kind of memory and learning concerns, it's important that there's supports in place that allow that child to succeed and thrive in school. And so Michigan Alliance for Families is a Michigan state-specific resource that talks about different kind of different kinds of elements of IEPs and 504 plans that are more kind of attuned to Michigan law. And then also there's more of this is a national center. They're based out of Minnesota, but the PACER Center is a Champions for Center for Children with Disabilities and just kind of learning differences overall. And they have really, really good resources across a number of different important kind of domains. So, right, so one might be around communication and technology, or what might be helpful there. And while there is a membership for out-of-state individuals, there could be really cool ideas for technology, learning aids, et cetera. If your child is having difficulty with, say, math or memory or reading, there might be some good ideas here for there. If it's more, if there's cognitive concerns in terms of intellectual disability, this is a great resource too in terms of thinking about ways to address adaptive behaviors or other supports that might be more pertinent for that the population relative to kind of just school and IEPs and 504 plans. And both, I believe, would do a good job addressing kind of just what that plan looks like over the course of school, what to expect in terms of those conferences, and the differences between like 504 plans, which are generally a bit more informal, and IEPs, which are more formal, and kind of how to navigate those processes there. So two great resources on that component. And then for technology, I was thinking about, what things that parents might see around technology. And I will be totally honest and say that, neuropsychological test development is probably a bit farther behind than TikToks and Instagram and kind of all of these kind of social media pieces. And I think common sense media is a good way to think about sort of, this important influence for either children and adolescents in terms of the content they're seeing and what they might be consuming. Granted, a lot of it is review-based, so keep in mind that both parents and children alike are giving reviews on a whole wide range of kind of content. So take that with a grain of salt, kind of like say a Yelp restaurant review. But I do find that there are certain trends that I'm just hearing about now as a neuropsychologist. I'm sure might be going on for a while. And this is kind of a good website to kind of have on hand. And then finally, this is mindapps.org. So I would say the other big piece that I've been trying to put more into my reports is thinking about kind of mobile apps. So a lot of individuals are carrying a smartphone, adolescents in particular, but also parents too. And there's a ton of apps that exist out there. Laura really knows what that number is exactly, but this is a good resource in the sense that the FDA has kind of had a hands-off approach to some of these apps, saying like, hey, app developers can develop it, that's okay. This specific group uses 105 questions that are based on the American Psychiatric Associations or APA app evaluation to kind of talk about these apps. And granted, they might be a bit more for maybe adolescents or for parents hoping to kind of keep track of things or monitoring their behaviors, but it helps to start with those 105 questions and kind of narrow things down and talk a bit more about what the app is intended to do or how it might work. This might be a really good starting point to find an app that might be kind of fun to use because you have the element of tech and without necessarily having to sift through just a very intimidating Apple store or a kind of other app-based store. And so a lot of good apps here. They do tend to be about more kind of behavioral health or mental health or kind of physical health changes. So not all of them will be applicable, but certainly they could be a good way to help begin thinking about what apps or tech might be most helpful moving forward. So those are the broad-based ones. And I do want to talk about just some general kind of notes on these kind of interventions and strategies, right? So when I was thinking about kind of the discussion, there's kind of almost too much information out there in terms of like what can be done or what you should or shouldn't do. And as a parent, it becomes quite overwhelming in terms of, what is the best or kind of most optimal way to do that. And in some ways there is no right way, but there's no right way. And it's also important that with these apps and resources that there's no magic wand or light switch that will instantly and permanently address an area of weakness or growth, right? We're not going to see an area of cognitive weakness and maybe do something really quickly, like give a special vitamin, and that will suddenly become an area of strength. A lot of these kind of interventions and strategies take time. And I can write that addressing any of these domains, let's say, for example, You know that a child has a working memory weakness and you want to work on organization. And so you might want to start a new organization system. We'll say for the backpack first. The room might be too big. Let's start with the backpack. Let's start small. Well, during the school year, that's probably going to take 4 to 8 weeks of just really daily effort, using the new skills, right? Making sure we're putting the papers in the folder, making sure all the folders are there, charting the behaviors, right? Making sure that the process is being followed, and monitoring the progress. So thinking about, has this been a good week for the backpack organization? Been a not so great week? It's going to take a lot of kind of trial and error in that intensive phase to kind of start this new skill, start this new intervention, again, to address maybe an area of kind of cognitive growth or an area of weakness. After that, there's the maintenance phase, right? You want to make sure that, hey, we spent the whole fall semester organizing this backpack. Let's make sure the spring semester is as okay. So that also kind of has its own phase in terms of being, you're keeping mindful of this new backpack organization system, and you're also keep applying it. And then also relapse prevention, right? So with school, that's kind of an easier one in the sense that, hey, there's probably 3 months where there's no school going on, where there isn't a backpack system. And so you want to be mindful that there's like planning a backpack trip day to the library or out in the community, or something that helps with that relapse prevention phase, where you're keeping that organization skill coming naturally, and you're kind of practicing kind of that over the long term. Right. So this is a lot. I would say this is a considerable amount of effort for, say, backpack organization that can have important effects, right? If your backpack is organized, one of the big issues I hear sometimes with children who are having difficulties in school is that the homework gets done but doesn't get turned in. And so if this backpack organization piece is a big driver of that weakness or that area of growth, then there can be a lot of benefit from here, but there is kind of a strong amount of cost involved there. And importantly, I want to mention that, right, regardless of chronic medical conditions or mental health conditions or wherever someone is in sort of humanity, behavior change is hard, right? Doing something new, getting a new skill, or intentionally addressing something you know that isn't your strength is really difficult. And so having a neutral party or coach, such as a therapist, can really make this behavior change less difficult. As someone who has worked in therapeutic settings with families, even on just like, you'll be surprised at how quickly complex or how many moving parts are involved with something kind of as easy as a behavior plan. Because you want to make sure that it's objective, so people can see what's kind of going on. It can be really, really helpful to have that neutral party as a therapist to help, take steps back as needed, think about, how they could enact the policy, or like how an outside observer, a fly on the wall, could see and say, oh, yep, that's a good behavior versus that behavior is not in line with change. Having the therapist can be a really kind of helpful piece there. And then finally, as a parent or a caregiver, I would consider kind of personal circumstances too. If you know that it's going to be a busy time for travel or family stuff, or you know that work is particularly stressful for both you and or your partner, or other emotional stressors going on, it can be really difficult to hold both that and the behavioral change endeavor for a child or for an intervention there. And so think about ways that you're also kind of addressing your own circumstances, needs, things like that, when also addressing kind of behavioral change. So that's kind of my larger note on kind of those interventions and strategies. Again, I think there's a lot of good content in those areas or in terms of skills, but being mindful that these skills can take time, and it's important to have self-compassion and say, hey, we're not going to get it perfect right off the bat. Let's be mindful about kind of those other steps there. And so, given the broad kind of start in terms of, say, sleep and growth mindset, kind of those more kind of larger ingredients to good behavioral change, to those kind of very specific resources I talked about in terms of schools or media, I want to talk a little bit about, say, cognitive training. And I kind of talked about this at the middle group, but it might be saying, hey, if we know that, say, processing speed is an area of weakness, why not just train processing speed over and over again? And so processing speed kind of being just an efficiency task. Let's say it's a simple measure, matching, just kind of looking at shapes and seeing which ones match. Let's just have a child, train on that for some portion of the week. And this was, I would say, a big deal kind of early in the late 2000s. This paper's in kind of 2008. And like one of the earlier papers of these where they just trained someone on working memory. So in this case, working memory would be defined as, like, say, a digit span task where I gave you a string of digits, say maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 digits long. And your task was to kind of remember the digits I just told you, maybe in a different order, kind of maybe in sequence. That would be kind of a working memory task. And children, in this case, adults or psychology students, they just practiced working memory tasks. Then they took a fluid intelligence task later. And a fluid intelligence task is going to be a bit more things around patterns or inference. So it's not really working memory, right? I guess it'd be kind of akin to if I wanted to become a really good basketball player, right? It's the idea that it kind of follows some exercise. If I do maybe certain arm and leg exercises, that'll make my shot a bit better as a kind of far transfer. And this early group did see an effect where those who did the training group did see increased or better performance on a fluid intelligence task compared to the control group. Now, this was 15 years ago, and there's been a whole, like, I know there was a cog med phase or kind of a really big kind of cognitive training phase going on. And now there's been increasing reports of just, okay, given all of these studies, can we combine them all together and see what the effects might be? Is this kind of helpful or not very helpful? In this kind of speech bubble, was a 2020 paper based on a review of kind of a lot of different kind of cognitive training exercise or cognitive training studies. And essentially across these 41 studies, 2,300 children, which is a much higher number than just the 34 and 35 in this group here, they found maybe small to medium effects on near transfer, but zero effects for far transfer. So meaning they're not seeing working memory then go to, say, fluid intelligence or some other far skill. A lot of these children and who are typically developing are just getting better at that task, right? You're getting good practice on that working memory task, and you're getting better at working memory. You know, maybe it goes to maybe a different working memory task slightly, but it's really about kind of working memory in general. Now, and I kind of mentioned this in the sense that I do know that there can be programs around cognitive training that seem like that they make sense and that they might show effects, but cognitive training might not be the specific way in which to kind of address these skills. And kind of more specifically, executive function skills, which we talked a little bit about earlier, but there are these related skills that are, again, were really, really popular between, say, 2010, 2020, still popular now, of working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. So inhibitory control might be, if you're seeing something a lot and you need to stop, you're able to stop when you need to, kind of inhibit that response. And cognitive flexibility might be just, can you see patterns or things from different ways? Can you represent information, different modalities to solve a problem or to kind of see an answer? And the reason these became so popular is because these three skills assist with planning, problem solving, and reasoning. And there's been some studies showing that if you're higher on these EF skills, they've been associated with higher achievement, health, wealth, and quality of life predictors, and they're important across childhood and adolescence. And also, we know that in terms of kind of epilepsy, these executive function skills are often directly affected because attention's kind of really underlies a lot of these EF skills. Attention's often disrupted in epilepsy. We're really mindful of this kind of EF skill development. And so another important piece of these is that these EF skills also go offline first and are most affected when we're stressed, sad, lonely, or, there might be some other kind of like colds or other kind of not great physical health situation kind of going on. And so they're both they're really important for a lot of these outcomes, but they're also the most affected when we're not feeling great, stressed, sad, lonely. And given the outcomes and kind of this push and pull, there was this really big push to train EF skills. And Diamond and Ling, we'll talk about that earlier, reviewed a lot of the research on, well, can we do something like, say, exercise, and will that make EF skills better? And I like the segue because there's a really cool group of researchers based out of Cincinnati Children's who developed this kind of epilepsy journey, is what they called it. And it was an intervention, a web-based intervention that really targeted these kind of EF skills. And now I really wanted to highlight these because when I think about these kind of concerns, so for example, a parent might say hard to remember homework, conversations, or medicines, distracted often, disorganized, right? Getting started on tasks is difficult, procrastination. These are a lot of the kind of primary problems that or concerns that parents raise when it comes to not just epilepsy, but kind of just a lot of the P's neuropsychology evaluations in general. And these aren't necessarily the specific kind of cognitive skills, they're not necessarily the specific cognitive skills we're measuring, but instead I see them as their behaviors, like the skills that we assess help underlie the behaviors you're hoping to see. So you want to see staying on attention, you want to see organization, you want to see those kind of good learning strategies. And so that's why I think the broad-based kind of teaching of different learning and strategies and methods across pieces is going to be more important for addressing the cognitive functioning with epilepsy than, say, specific things about memory. Now, I'll pause and say, if let's say, for example, we know there's a good visual memory strength, but a verbal memory weakness, it might be less about getting that verbal memory up versus saying, hey, are there ways we can make school more visual so that you can use that memory strength so that you're not getting distracted often or you're not forgetting as much. But I really appreciated seeing these so these were things brought up by both adolescents with epilepsy and their parents who are parenting the adolescent with epilepsy, just kind of talking about the different kind of major concerns, right? No one here is saying like my matrix reasoning or my specific fluid reasoning is bad. It really is these kind of larger based skills. And I think that would be kind of a key takeaway from the intervention piece is that there are specific methods that can be done. We want to make sure that they can be kind of broadly applied to different areas. And so I think a lot of these things here in particular are areas where we're kind of seeing difficulties within kind of school or for both children and adolescents. And they had a really interesting kind of framework where they had like the island of initiation, falls of inhibition, state of emotional control, orchard of organization, the peninsula of positive thoughts, right? This is mostly kind of a psychoeducational journey. You see the land of nod for sleep. When I was creating the presentation, like, wow, this maps onto kind of a lot of what I was kind of thinking about, where like you do have some memory skills, right? You're training kind of the monitoring, but these kind of come across different domains, like, right? So for monitoring, for example, you might think that, let's say that reading is going well and you have a child that can answer reading comprehension questions effectively. Let's just practice what reviewing those questions might look like so that when it comes to math, we built in the, hey, when I get to the end of an assignment, I'm reviewing the questions and I'm keeping track of what I'm doing. That kind of goes across these different ones here. Or for organization, right? Thinking about the backpack example, the room example, but it's kind of really all of these in particular that kind of help inform that kind of problem solving. And again, sleep's also important too, and then just kind of the state of emotional control as well. It's all kind of a bigger kind of piece. And so related to kind of that bigger journey, I would say that when it comes to promoting the executive functions or thinking about staying organized, keeping on track of things in a very kind of broad-based fashion, I would think about, and with these ones being studied, they did find that if you're going to do like an activity for mindfulness, Tai Chi or Taekwondo were most successful at improving executive function skills. So in this sense, it's like a physical movement task that's also paired with, I would say, very much attention regulation in terms of, doing different forms or reflecting or being very mindful of pausing. Like it's not just like the Taekwondo, you don't want the ones where it's maybe competitive and it's a bit more on the highly physical side. You want the ones that are geared more towards progression or being mindful about movement, kind of things like that. There were also some school programs and some cognitive training programs at the time of publication. But when it comes to some of the cognitive training programs, there was kind of more of an emphasis on the coaching relationship as part of kind of cognitive training versus the kind of cognitive training itself. So we want, again, I do want to be mindful that right, it's probably more important to have, for me, a tutor or relationship or mentorship with an adult, be it a parent or someone out in the community that can teach these skills of organization, growth mindset that they get along with well, versus say like we need to be training, we need to get your verbal memory better, kind of things like that. And really, again, the takeaways again include that there is transfer, but it's often narrow, kind of how I was talking about earlier with kind of the different size and points. The EF gains depend on the amount of time spent practicing. How the activity is presented and conducted is important, right? If we're thinking about school just, oh, it needs to get done and that's it, that might not lead to sustained motivation or engagement that we'd hope. They need to be continually challenged, right? And so this is why, like, right, and I think about video games, think about, oh, we get to a level, well, things increase in difficulty, it gets more fun. If video games are really boring, they would not be as inherently as engaging as they are. They need to kind of be continuously challenged. Once practice ends, the benefits diminish. And I say a lot of the pieces here, I think that I really think it's important to balance these intervention efforts with existing time and financial resources, right? So we can't just always be on in tutoring and things like that. There has to be time for fun social engagement, right? There's really good skills that are learned over the course of play, or maybe non-structured tasks that might both benefit EFs and just help with general family well-being. And it's really important to kind of consider this in terms of the interventions in both the time and financial resource perspective too. And then again, I just want to be very mindful that, right, there are claims that you can get wide transfer from these skills, and really does not seem to occur. Don't really expect that if you're doing steps or just a mindless aerobic exercise that's going to improve EFs. And I really like the ending of this paper here, where they talk about, since we know that these negative effects can impair EFs, so besides directly training them, the most successful approaches for improving EF skills will also address emotional, social, and physical needs. And so the more that you can kind of fit either organizational pieces or learning into something the child truly enjoys or is connected with, I think the much better for kind of the improvement in these there. So that's kind of why I've leaned a bit more towards a broad-based approach to these types of skills. And certainly, that's not to do a disservice to the narrow. A lot of the websites I've mentioned will have very specific strategies for doing that. And so along that realm, really good resources here. So again, understood.org, if it's talking about cognitive flexibility and there's an inflexibility challenge, they have a how to help. Have your child show you your teacher's methods and different ways that you can integrate these skills into kind of everyday learning and problem solving. The Dartmouth Academic Skills Center is something I've been recommending for a while. It's really kind of comprehensive. It is open to the public. You don't have to be a student there to get access to a lot of their aids. Smart But Scattered is a book that a lot of neuropsychologists recommend for 4 to 13-year-olds. And there's an adolescent version too that talks about kind of these different EF skills, organizational pieces. And again, I want to be very mindful that they have very concrete ways to aid that within these resources. So for memory, for example, try new learning styles, create a framework, practice review materials. And I see those specific things as maybe important parts of a larger system to address what's being affected by epilepsy or a specific memory weakness or things like that. But I really wanted to talk about kind of the broad-based nature of behavioral change, think about how best these interventions can be implemented. Because I know it can be frustrating to go through all 8 to be like, well, back where we started, what happened? And that can be really frustrating from a parent perspective. So I want to talk about some of the key ingredients there. So I will pause. So that's kind of, I'm happy to talk about any of the formats in terms of the questions or discussions, or happy to talk about more specific resources too that I found helpful about specific skills. But that's kind of the key things I came to mind when thinking about this topic.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Almy. That was really informative. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. If you want to think about it for a bit, that's fine too. You can also enter questions into the chat. So I'll wait a few moments to see if anyone has any questions, and if not, I do have some myself. So
awesome.
Hi, I have one question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yep, perfectly.
Okay, awesome. So it seems like a day of neuropsychological testing, it takes a while. And I imagine it's pretty difficult to keep kids engaged throughout the entire day. So I was wondering if you had any tips for just keeping scores consistent throughout the day, because, if they decline or they get tired, yeah, just kind of how you go about that.
Yeah, really good. Yeah, great question. And certainly, like we're cognizant of that from a developmental perspective, where like right, we're not going to be putting a 4-year-old through the same kind of battery you might put, say, a 12 to 16-year-old. The second piece of that is I would take a lot of the stress or worry about that off the parent shoulders and say we have really well-trained psychometrists. They're really good at keeping children engaged. You'll be surprised what like a sticker book or well-timed breaks or just the process of things can do for attention. A lot of good ways that we kind of keep that keep that attention high. And I would say the second piece too is that around the psychometrist piece, they get a good understanding of the ebbs and flows. So just for example, I was working on a report today and someone mentioned that, oh, when this children was kind of talking through a task, they did a little bit better than when they didn't. And there's those kind of subtle observations, right? Really help inform my thinking around the strengths and weaknesses, but also they're part of that larger picture. We know that there's going to be general variability there, and we'll keep that in our piece. So a really great question, but I would say, we'll worry about that part. I certainly appreciate the view, but we have some tricks up our sleeve to help with that.
And kind
Thank
of,
you.
yeah, as a follow-up to that question too, I know scheduling a neuropsych evaluation can be months. You have to do that months ahead often. And so you've waited a long time. Let's say, a child has a seizure 24 hours or less before the session, that's, likely to impact their cognitive performance. How do you account for that? Like, do you ever suggest rescheduling or do you, increase the results by a certain percentage to account for that? Like, what do you do in those circumstances?
Yeah, really excellent question. So there is not, I would say, a great statistical way to account for that seizure beforehand, and I wish we could, but there's no way to kind of sort of recalibrate given that. I would say that I think like we're very cognizant of the fact that it's a snapshot in time, right? It gives us kind of like a rough crystal ball of kind of, what might the next school year look like, or where are we kind of seeing the most difficulties? If you're really concerned about that, like the specific seizure, or maybe a specific severe one, and certainly it can always be rescheduled, definitely. But we generally interview or think about like how seizures are happening or the frequency, or review the records to say, okay, given all of those pieces, what does this snapshot in time look like? And being mindful of just, okay, we know that high school is coming up. So what are the kind of big things about that piece that need to be balanced and all those things there? So I would say that there's like not a great, like say epilepsy specific or seizure specific kind of adjustment we can make. But on the individual level, we're thinking about, okay, parents mentioned they didn't get enough sleep last night because certainly we have kiddos travel pretty far for testing, and we know that they had to wake up at 4 a.m. We're not getting their best piece. So you always keep that in mind, but I think it's still a worthwhile snapshot to kind of guide the next steps, and we'll keep those performance pieces in mind.
Other questions? Okay, so I have another question. So some of our patients have significant intellectual disability or are nonverbal.
Yeah.
And in cases like that, how do you approach evaluation and like goal setting and suggested strategies and interventions differently than other kids?
Yeah, and so from the interview perspective, a lot of that will be thinking about, well, how is school kind of going so far? Is there paraprofessional support? Is paraprofessional support needed if we're talking about a severe or significant intellectual disability? For the testing, let's say that there are certain tests we can give that have a really wide range. So there's one test that goes from say age 2 to 90. And that can be kind of helpful just in terms of thinking about getting that estimate, or even thinking about just, even if it's a sixth grader with intellectual disability, where are they just on grade norms, or thinking about what are the skills that they can do. And there are certainly kind of tests we have or different things we can do to accommodate kind of a range of kind of presentations. The nonverbal nature can be a bit trickier. There's a more limited array of kind of nonverbal tests, or just in thinking about the evaluations are very kind of direction following and language intensive in terms of the comprehension piece. So for some of the verbal pieces, it can be trickier. But I think we do a good job of, thinking about the battery that would be most useful for next steps kind of going forward, and getting those kind of estimates of performance, and working with the child to say, okay, here's what we're seeing today in today's session. Here's what we want to hope for in school-worthy supports, given what we observed and given the parent reports on different testing. So I think that there are accommodations or kind of just ways we to push that a bit differently to accommodate that presentation.
Great. One other question, you had mentioned seeing a therapist as someone who may be able to help with kind of the ongoing behavior change and adjusting strategies and coaching and that sort of thing, because again, the neuropsych evaluation is going to give some recommendations, but it's sort of a one-time thing that may be repeated periodically. But who are some other providers, specific types of providers, who can assist with kind of the behavior change component and with the actual implementation and adjustment of strategies?
Yeah, and I think you hit on an important point where neuropsychology is generally being seen, once every 2 to 3 years, and sometimes that varies at a number of levels, but we're very much kind of a more infrequent provider compared to, say, someone like a mental health therapist that you're going to see weekly or kind of bi-weekly. So certainly I would say a therapist that addresses kind of family function and kind of parent coaching would be a really good one, just in terms of thinking about how you're communicating expectations, what the shared goals are for meeting kind of these interventions or changes in needs, what happens if it gets followed well, what happens when it doesn't get followed well. There's a whole range of questions I think that a mental health therapist or a counselor could be really well suited for. On other sides of providers, for individuals with maybe like an occupational therapist would be someone who might give specific recommendations around like routines at home, or kind of writing, or kind of different elements of school can be helpful for an occupational therapist that's being seen on a weekly basis. And then also give a shout out to speech therapy too, where if there are certain goals about if language is being affected primarily, you'll definitely want them in the corner. But if there are goals around communication in particular, that would be kind of more weekly or a high frequency visit. That would be help with kind of that change and coaching and things like that. But I do think that I think a mental health therapist might be uniquely situated in that, to the extent that they allow for a parent component or it's you, parent and child, that would be kind of the most helpful. We're all kind of game planning together versus just, the child comes back to the room for an hour and then goes back to the parent. So I think you really want that engagement or that option, I think, for best behavioral change.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you everyone for participating, and thank you so much, Dr. Almy, for a very insightful and helpful presentation. And this will be added to our YouTube channel and website, so please feel free to come back and watch again if you want to glean some more information from the presentation. So thanks again, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Almy.
Thanks.